Good to go, Dennis.
Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to this, the fourth episode of the online events from the Geneva Literary Aid Society GLAS, the GLAS Hour. We're very happy to have tonight as our guest, Colm Tóibín. Just some housekeeping before we get into it. Anybody who's having difficulty getting in touch with us on the Zoom link can try the Facebook live stream on our Facebook page. This is an effort by the Geneva Literary Aid Society to stay in touch with our followers and community during these difficult periods of the lockdown. At the same time, we continue to support street children in Darjeeling, India, and you will find on our website a place where you can find details of how to make a donation to them if you wish to support these ongoing free events. So you're very welcome, Colm. Colm Tóibín needs little introduction to an Irish audience. He's written 9 novels and 2 collections of short stories. He's been shortlisted for the Booker Prize 3 times. He's also written plays and many non-fiction titles. Welcome back to GLAS, Colm. Do we have Colm online?
What about that?
We got you, Colm, yeah.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Colm. I don't know if you remember the last time you were here. It was a very cold winter night, I believe. I recall it was raining. It was in the American Church Hall, and you did a great reading from The Master, which had just been published at that time.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah.
So that was about 10 years ago, I think. Was that your last time in Geneva?
Yeah, it was in the 40s. Yeah.
So, Colm, before we get started, I thought you might like to say a few words about the untimely passing of Eavan Boland. I believe she was a good colleague and friend of yours and somebody who inspired you. And in fact, she's on the first few pages of your introduction to the 3 gentlemen we'll be discussing shortly in Mad, Bad and Dangerous to Know.
Yeah, she was a tremendous figure. I think as a poet, she was someone who really made it new. In other words, that her first book, New Territory, is the poems are so well made, so chiseled, so sort of distant. They're like English movement poems. Obviously, the figures who have influenced her greatly are, Eliot and Yeats and the English poets of the 1950s. But she really made a change in her work very quickly from that, where as she said herself, in Ireland, the woman has been in the poem. I want to be the woman who writes the poem. And that might seem a very small thing, but for her it was a very big thing because it meant that she was going to write for the first time about things like getting up in the middle of the night to feed a baby. And that business, she said, Irish poetry is so good with bombs, so bad with babies. It's so good with hills, so bad with suburbs. I'm a woman in the suburbs. I have a baby. Where is the poem about me? And if it's not there, I will write it. And she wrote 2 books of prose, really making space for herself in that sort of territory. And then her work from then on became a way of trying to link how she lived with the Irish poem. And one of the ways she did this was by spending a great deal of time in America, where this had already been worked out in a number of ways by various women poets, including Adrienne Rich and Denise Levertov, both of whom she came to know. And she ran the writing program at Stanford. I worked with her there. She was a superb university administrator. She came in with an extraordinary mixture of toughness and charm, and ran the department in an extraordinary way. People loved her. She was really good with people. I was there once when a student was in terrible trouble, and he was arrogant and he was bad. And she got him out of all the trouble. And when he remained arrogant and bad, she just said, well, these people are sent to try us. I mean, this is what we're here for. And so she was a great colleague. She was a wonderful person. She was a great poet. And it's really amazing for me that there was so much energy in her and so much life in her eyes when coming into a room, so much good humor, so much seriousness. And she was one of the crucial people, of course, in the campaign to make Mary Robinson president. She was a close friend of Mary Robinson's. you know, when we finally were able to see her papers, we realized the extraordinary amount of work that she did on that campaign of giving Mary Robinson a certain tone, which Mary Robinson was able to use in a way was a mixture of a lawyer and a poet, with the poet's extraordinary command of tone and Mary Robinson's sort of seriousness, and that actually, you know, I think made a big difference to the sort of to a sort of softening of Mary Robinson's tone that made her appeal to great numbers of people. I think Eavan was really crucial in doing that. So, and of course, she was more than anything. She left her daughters, her grandchildren, her husband, Kevin. You know that she was a changed person once her family got mentioned. She moved from being this very public figure, this very serious, figure who prepare everything she did so well, into this very she really loved Dundrum. And living in the suburbs and having her family there, and I think so. She was a great mixture of things, and really great company.
It's quite poignant the way she came home to escape the coronavirus and died.
Yeah, but I at least, you know, it was good that she was home, because I mean, no matter what you say, being on the Stanford campus in Palo Alto during a lockdown would not be ideal.
How do you think the literary world is coping with the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think some writers are sort of bedwetters anyway. I mean, they're sort of paranoid to start with, so the smallest thing would preoccupy them and say, I haven't been able to work since Christmas because A, the frost, B, the cold, C, you know, the government. And now they've got another thing, and they're at home, I suppose, making everyone's life a misery. They're doing a sort of very sort of personal social distancing. But other people are, of course, there's a poem by Anthony Hecht, the American poet, that starts, during the plague, I came into my own. And there are people who are coming into their own during the plague, meaning that they're working harder than ever, or reading something, or reading Proust finally, or you know, translating Dostoevsky. And so yeah, there are a lot of people probably taking real advantage of this. I mean, writing a book is a sort of lockdown, and so it's another lockdown.
You're working on a book yourself.
Yeah, I think it's important not to feel sorry for writers at the moment. I think there are people to feel sorry for, and we're not in that group.
I feel more sorry for the book
lovers.
lovers.
Because you work from home, because you haven't lost your job.
Mm.
Therefore, you're in a sort of different category to people, especially in America, because there really isn't any net to actually catch you when you fall in America. And a lot of people have simply lost their jobs. A lot of people just not paying people. A lot of people have, you know, there's a very weak system of employment law. It's not like Europe, so
you won't miss the festival circuit.
I will miss it. Yeah, I mean, there were things I was going to do that I was looking forward to. And
what about the Stowe Writers' Week?
It's usually the Writers' Week being one of them. That I mean, the extraordinary amount of work to get a lot of people to agree to come, and then set up the logistics, and then all that's for nothing now. I mean, that's really hard for people to run festivals.
Yeah, I must say I'm really looking forward to going back to Listowel this year for the 50th anniversary.
Well, we'll just make next year, we'll make 2021 into a great year. It'll be so great to walk out of this. I have a dream. It's like when you're a kid, you want ice cream. When I think I want to get up in the morning in Venice sometime in the future, and just get up about 8 in the morning, just wander around as the shutters are coming up on the shops, and sit outside at the table, and the hour before the museum's open, and just sit around and look at things. Yeah, that's all I want to do, really.
Right. Colm, let's turn our attention to this wonderful book, Mad, Bad, Dangerous to Know, Fathers of Wilde, Yeats and Joyce. I must say I've really enjoyed reading it again over the last few days. And what I loved particularly about the introduction was the way you evoked Dublin, particular perspective on Dublin. You know, any of us who are students of Dublin, particularly during the 70s, it immediately resonates with us. You know, the picture you draw, and you bring out wonderfully the kind of city it must have seemed like to the characters in your book. How important is Dublin to you personally?
I've never been able to write about it as in fiction. It's not my city. I'm from Enniscorthy, and I think Dubliners will tell you, don't think that you can do this. But I've lived in it for a long time, and I was trying to think. Some days in Dublin, you never think about Joyce, Yeats, Beckett. You just you're busy, you're doing something else, you're going down to Grafton Street, you're going to the bank. You know, these things are not, it's not as though Dubliners are permanently engaged. But once you start, and there's a particular walk I'm thinking about where you could start up, say, Stephen's Green and walk down. And say you're walking down Kildare Street and you're passing the National Library. And you're thinking about all the people who've been in the library. You're thinking about the sequence in Ulysses that occurs in the library. You're thinking about the portrait of the artist in the library. You're thinking about Yeats writing about the actual reading room of the library. You're thinking about your own life in the 70s in the reading room of the library. Then a little thing comes into your head that Boswell's Hotel opposite was a great place to go from the library when the library closed. And they had a really cheap Bulgarian wine called Gamza. I don't know what Gamza is, but it was really cheap in the 70s. And those slow associations remind you of the way Leopold Bloom works as he wanders around the city, that one thing leads to another in his mind. But if you go down, just going a bit faster, and you go around, you go into Clare Street, which is where Samuel Beckett's father had his business, where upstairs at one point Beckett actually wrote and promised he was going to actually really become a serious writer just to get some money from his mother. You go along further, you go to the house, of course, of Oscar Wilde's family on the corner of Merrion Square. Having passed earlier, you've passed Finn's Hotel, the hotel that Nora Barnacle worked in, and the place where James Joyce and Nora Barnacle actually met each other for the first time. And you're turning then into Westland Row. And Westland Row really is extraordinary because Wilde was born there. Because in Ulysses, Leopold Bloom walks along Westland Row. He's got many things on his mind, including sex. He's trying to have an affair with a woman called Martha Clifford. And he's pretending he's called Henry Flowers. And he goes into the church. And James Joyce's, and let me think, his father and his grandmother, coming up from Cork, actually lived at one point in Westland Row and had offices there. So you're thinking about a world in which you have the Joyces, the older generation, Wilde's father, the older generation, and the idea in 1904 of Leopold Bloom walking in this. Actually, he walks up from Lombard Street, and there's a Undertakers still there, Nichols Undertakers is there in Ulysses. And as you're walking up Westland, it's impossible. Well, obviously they're not the same people. But it's the same name, and obviously the grandchildren or something like that are running it. So there are levels of pure continuity from Ulysses, as obviously the church is still there. No one knocks down churches, so the church is still there. And when you come to the top of the street, I mean, if you just turn around and go the other way, going up to the top of the street, you come to Sweeney's Chemist. It's a bit of a pity now that that's become a Joycean monument rather than a working chemist shop. But there was a time when you could go in there with a prescription and just get whatever you're looking for, and then ask them for some lemon soap, because that's what Leopold Bloom gets. And it's really odd. It's one of the funny moments of, Ulysses plays with so many different narrative techniques, but one of them is realism, that Leopold Bloom has this soap in his pocket throughout the book. By the end of the book, he washes his hands, he actually opens the soap, but every so often, in the book, at the end of chapters often, Leopold Bloom, you realize he's got something in his pocket, he forgets what it is. Oh, it's the lemon soap that he bought in Sweeney's. So I'm thinking about that idea of layers of memory, of personal memory. Around the corner, there was the Academy Cinema. That's where I saw Amarcord first. And, you go through the number of different things that happened to you in that street. And then happened in the literary moments in that street. So you're talking about sort of layers and layers and layers of things that if you look at the street, if you were an outsider or you didn't know any of this, you looked at the street, it's a pretty rundown looking street. It's not got, yes, there's one plaque for Oscar Wilde in the house where he was born, but it's not a street with big guides telling you this is a really important literary street, but it is. But it doesn't look like that. It looks down at heel. There are several derelict buildings in the street. But that's one of the experiences of Dublin you can have, where a street that looks ordinary actually has layers and layers and layers of not only memory but literary memory. And so I was trying to write about that in the first chapter of the book.
Well, you do it so well, and I noted your sentence that I don't think that I have ever been so happy as during those first months in the National Library.
Yeah, the National Library I don't know, but it's there in Ulysses where, no one reads a book in that chapter. They all just sit around and talk about Shakespeare and anything that's on their mind, the literary revival. But the National Library for me was a great social space. In other words, that you of course you would be in there all day, you'd be reading your book, but you'd be looking to see who else was coming in and going out. And if someone you knew was going out, of course, it was a time of smokers. And I was a smoker, so you go out for a smoke, and you'd never know who you'd meet outside who was also smoking. And then the College of Art people, the College of Art was actually almost the same building, and they would pass by. And I always thought College of Art people, they made their own clothes. They were totally exciting to look at. We were historians. We were trying to look, we wear tweed and stuff, but they were exotic, like birds. And the boys, I noticed, were often very small. The girls very tall, and they walked together with their portfolios. And the other side was the Doyle, so you could see all the politicians going in and out. And then somebody could meet someone who just could say in the afternoon, why don't we just go for a drink? I say, I can't go for a drink, I'm going to be reading. I say, we'll just go for one. And I mean, I got into trouble in the library because you would end up staying in various pubs and wandering around Dublin, and then you'd leave all your books and things in the library. You come in the morning all sorrowful, hungover, to say to the librarians, I'm really sorry about last night. And they said, yeah, we really can't store your things overnight for you. So the library was tremendous fun. And I mean, the reading was great, but the actual institution itself. And then there were always weirdos. I mean, people who looked weird coming in and out, doing genealogical work or doing strange work. People hadn't washed for a long time, or hadn't cut their hair for a while, or it just looked so studious. I looked as though they'd written many books. But the Dublin at that time was filled with people also who had written no books, but were about to write one. And were sitting in Keogh's or Tobin's or the Bailey or somewhere about to write this book. And it was known they were about to write a book. And that was it was famous. They were famous for being about to write a book. And that has died out. That business of being about to write a book in Dublin has died out. People now write the books. I'm not sure if this is better or worse, but it certainly changed the atmosphere. There's less dandruff in Dublin, which is sort of
a lot more books coming out of Dublin.
Yeah, there's just less dandruff. I mean, everyone just was pouring dandruff, pouring down their backs and their shoulders. I don't know. It must be this new shampoo, Head and Shoulders, has just obliterated dandruff.
Yeah,
it was really the national. It was the national dust, was dandruff.
Like chalk.
Yeah.
So coming to the first character in your book, Colm, the father of Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty, Wilde. You used the phrase unmoored strangeness to describe the vibe that was coming from Sir William Wilde and his wife.
Yeah, the Wildes are interesting because they're part of a ruling class in Dublin. He is Sir William Wilde. He's knighted by Queen Victoria for his work on the census returns. And he's an important eye-and-ear doctor, and he's an important epidemiologist and statistician. And they give very good parties. And Lady Wilde herself is a translator. She becomes a figure of fun later on in London, but in these years in Dublin, she's not a figure of fun, as much as people do gossip about her and think about her. W.B. Yeats's father has a letter where it says that she was found once by Mrs. Isaac Butt, in flagrante with Isaac Butt. And Sir William Wilde had at least 3 illegitimate children. But that's not as important as the idea of their gnarled allegiances. In other words, that they were a ruling eminent Victorians in Dublin. They were a ruling class, but they gave their allegiance to an Ireland. And they were the first Protestants maybe to do this, to give their allegiance to an Ireland of culture, to an Ireland of the future, to an ancient Ireland. He was an archaeologist. He was an antiquarian. So that the idea of, for example, he wrote a book on the Corrib, he wrote a book on the Boyne, but it slowly became political. In other words, for them, it was also about an Ireland of the future. So they, on one hand, they were taking their knighthoods from the Queen, and they were operating in Dublin as a ruling class. But on the other hand, something else was entering their spirit, which was almost nationalism, but was certainly about a sort of cultural revival in Ireland. And Yeats took Lady Wilde very seriously, and she certainly had an influence on Bram Stoker, who came to the parties in their house. The Wilde family and the Yeats family were friends. But what I'm talking about is a time when Protestants in Ireland, some Protestants, and this would later, of course, culminate in Yeats and Lady Gregory, but that the Wildes were an important element in the beginnings of this. I'm talking about in the 1860s, 1870s. of beginning to look at the Irish landscape and find elements in the Irish landscape which suggested a very ancient and rich culture, and also to look at texts and find that the ancient Irish texts were had an extraordinary life in them, and that the idea of translation was not just merely an academic business, but a way of showing Irish people that there was a sort of an astonishing richness in culture. So that the Wildes worked like this, and of course they did whatever they liked. They made he made a lot of money, so that their freedom to be two things at the same time, to be, you know, the ruling class and somehow aligning themselves with an Ireland of the future, made its way into this thing. I think the social realm, their parties were exciting because you never knew who was coming, and into their sex lives in that they really took whatever freedoms were available at the time.
Is it true that Oscar learned Gaelic thanks to his father accompanying him?
Well, he certainly would have heard it. I'm not sure he learned it, and I'm not sure also how much of it his father knew. In a way, it's like any Protestant of that sort knowing any Irish at all would create excitement. But there's certainly two schools of thought. One saying that Sir William had fluent Irish, but I don't think he did. I just think he knew enough of it to make a real difference. You know, you see his work in something like The Census Returns, where there's so many different words in Irish, and including some in English, being used in Ireland for illnesses, that to try and be an epidemiologist, to try and work out if you have scrofula, and you're trying to work out what is the Irish word for that? What is the Irish word for arthritis? And there's so many different words, and he was the one who systematized that. He was the one who knew enough Irish to be able to say that word, there are 20 words and all of them equal one thing in English. And we're going to allow all of them to come under one banner in English. Of course, this was huge because it, for example, for cause of death, which he was able to work with from the 1840s onwards, it's really important that the authorities knew what caused death in Ireland, because there were so many words for illnesses. But he was the one who put order on that. He was one of those ordering Victorians who put order on the treatment of illnesses of the eyes and of the ears. I mean, there were so many quacks wandering around. You just look at the advertisements in the papers in those years. Everyone had a treatment for it. It's like a Donald Trump is, you should inject bleach. And Sir William Wilde was the one who actually he had studied in Vienna, he'd studied in London, and he really applied science to this, and he became an important, especially ear doctor.
I have a question here for you, Colm, from a 12-year-old living in Geneva. I think lockdown is great. When did you know that you wanted to be a writer, and how did you know? Thanks, Molly.
Oh, when I was about 12, in our house, you were meant to go, because you were in secondary school, you were meant to go and study every evening. I couldn't. I just bored. I mean, science and Latin and things. So I wrote poetry. You know, I used the time when I was meant to. You know, as long as you were in the room on your own, you had your head down, no one noticed what you were doing. So I was just, without planning this, without thinking I want to be a writer, I just wrote poems in the evening, and I revised them and I kept them in a little book, and that slowly became a life. You know, that's what I did, and I found out the hard way that I couldn't really write poetry. You know, in the sense that I sent the poems to magazines and they were sent back to me. People didn't want them. And then I moved. I mean, all of us have a sort of DNA where some people are playwrights and some people are novelists and some are poets. And slowly it emerged that I was probably a novelist. But it was a gradual process. But it began around 12.
And you've tried your hand at everything except poetry. What's your favorite medium?
But the day job is basically writing novels. Yeah.
You prefer that to anything else?
Well, I can do it. I mean, I don't have to sit across. Like, I still write poems sometimes, but there's no great demand. I don't find people saying, "Oh my God, even you poem." It doesn't happen like that. Sad.
What do you think was the biggest influence that his father had on Oscar?
Oh, I suppose the idea of culture, the idea of social life and cultural life, and that you sort of could become anyone. But I think the important thing is that he died when Oscar was 21. So just as Oscar Wilde is going to Oxford from Trinity College Dublin, And just as he's about to reinvent himself in England, his father dies. I think this is important, where his father's death gives him a sort of freedom that he can now start posing and changing his accent as he does in England, and becoming this aesthete and this figure who's got very witty things to say. But I certainly think that house in Merrion Square with the mother translating and the father becoming this eminent figure. I mean, in other words, he was becoming famous for his work with sense. But there was a sense, I suppose, of self-importance. I think, you see, there was no parliament in Dublin, so you had no political ruling class. So the Wildes were a ruling class. So when Oscar Wilde went to England, he had this extraordinary confidence that Irish people can often have in England, because even if you're just from some sort of family in a small town without much money, you can feel a sort of sense of your own importance in the town, which Wilde certainly, when he came from this ruling class family in Dublin, he came to England as though he owned the place, and he had, he could treat the English as a sort of lower order, and that he could mock them, be funnier than they were, write better plays than they did. And eventually, of course, he misunderstood them.
The famous court case which almost brought down his parents, that had echoes.
Yeah, his father had a patient called Mary Travers, and Mary Travers alleged later on that he had raped her, that as a patient. But she was certainly a patient, and she became a friend of the family. And I think she became a bloody nuisance, and the family wanted to drop her, and she really didn't want to be dropped. And so when dropped, she became poisonous and caused him a lot of grief, and eventually brought a libel action against Lady Wilde. And so the whole thing was in the open. And I think everyone was pretty surprised at the intimacy with which, her relationship with the family seemed intimate. And certainly it looked as though there was some sort of sexual relationship between her and Sir William Wilde. But she got a farthing damages, but the costs were very high. But what was interesting was the medical profession and in general society supported Sir William. After the trial, he didn't lose all his friends, and he wasn't ostracized. And Oscar Wilde was about 12 at that time. And it certainly would have been a lesson to him. Look how much you can get away with. Look how, if you live in a way that seems outside all the rules governing the rules that are meant to be governing Victorian life, that you can actually survive, that you can actually do as you please. And of course, once he was in England, he discovered he was wrong. Oh. But his father's example would not have helped him to be very, very careful when the English get Puritan, when the English get all guarded, be very afraid.
Just a word, Colm, about your experience in Reading Jail reading De Profundis. That's quite described in the book.
Yeah, Reading Jail was used until 2011 as a prison for young offenders. So it's a pretty grim place, because you go into each cell and there are 2 bunk beds, and you can see where a little TV, a little table, a toilet, and a basin. And obviously, these kids, these young offenders, were locked in there all day, or for 23 hours of the day. And it was an absolutely miserable place. But you can go into Wilde's cell and you can see the sky that he saw. And so what they asked me to do was to read De Profundis in the cell with the door locked. People could look in at me through a peephole, and it was live streamed on into the church. I read most of it. I think the reading lasted 5.5 hours, which I did with a toilet break, just incidentally. But trying to read De Profundis, which I think is one of his greatest works, trying to find a tone for it, that I found that it's a much more melancholy, gentle text when I have to read it out loud than I thought it was when you read it on the page. So it's just, also I felt that it was written in an Irish accent, that his accent wavered. I mean, people said that he could speak with an Irish accent just as easily as he could with an English one. But this seems to me to be written in a sort of sad Irish accent.
Another question from a viewer, Colm. Anne Harper from Tremor asks, how important to your own development as a writer was that summer in 1972 that you spent working as a barman in the Grand Hotel in Tremor and reading the essential Hemingway on the beach? Is that true?
Yeah, I got a job in the bar. I was a terrible barman. It was a time when massive drinking had overcome the Irish people. And everything was about an extension. Where was the extension? The Grand Hotel, this massive ballroom, had an extension.
You must have been working there during race week.
No, it was just an ordinary summer. It was honestly, it wasn't race week. It was just an ordinary summer. And if you're on the bar,
they have the famous races in Tramore every August.
yeah, but no, this wasn't that. This was just people coming up to you. I mean, 1:30 in the morning, saying kind of 3 pints of Guinness, 2 vodkas, and tonic, and one. And you go, oh my God, how am I going to remember all this? And of course, putting the pints of Guinness was sort of time. And then the person you had wanted, where was that person? Because a bar 4 thick of people shouting at you, wanting drinks, more and more drinks. And then when you went to clean up, they hadn't even drunk a whole lot of them. The vodka would be left. So I learned a lot about drinking, but often you had the afternoons off because the night was busy. And I brought a book with me called The Essential Hemingway, which had the full text of The Sun Also Rises, as well as some short stories. And on the beach in the afternoons, and that's what I did. I read that. And it must have been about 16 or 17. I was probably 17. And I thought it was a marvelous book. I still do think it's a marvelous book, The Sun Also Rises. And I love the narrator. I love the hero, Jake, and I love all the people he meets, and I love how they all go to Spain and have such a good time and fall out. And
you followed in their footsteps.
Yeah, I did. I think it's a marvelous book. I did follow in their footsteps, and it's a marvelous book about being young and discovering Spain.
Question from Linda Nolan in Dublin. She says, has your view of George Orwell changed in any way over the years?
No, I don't think so.
No.
He really wrote very well, and he wrote a lot. Thinking up both Animal Farm in 1984, he put 2 words into the language, Big Brother and 1984, and but some of the essays are actually classics of their kind. I mean, Shooting an Elephant, or the one about hanging, he was very wise. Homage to Catalonia has a marvelous, but before he gets involved in all the politics to do with Trotskyists, his description of anarchism of a city, a European city taken over by anarchists and run on anarchist principles. His description of that is better than anybody else's. And I think I've read all the accounts on the Spanish and Catalan sides, all the memoirs by various people. Orwell's is better. It's better because he wrote better. It's better because he noticed more. But also I think because he was an outsider and he was understood that this will not happen again in history. This will not come back. We will never have again, at least as far as I understand things, who can say, but we will never have anarchists taking over a city in Europe again and running it according to anarchist principles. I don't think it will come back. And he was the great witness of that. And his witness is a beautiful piece of work. It's about 100 pages. This is in homage to Catalonia. I mean, the rest of the book goes on. He has grudges against all sorts of communists, and he's got things to say about that. But the actual body of the book is still amazing, I think.
Well, coming on to John B. Yeats, the father of the illustrious I found this a very interesting section of the book, Colm, because you actually do a bit of investigation yourself, a bit of detective work, find out something more about the man and his work by visiting his family.
Yeah, you mean John Butler Yeats?
Yeah, you went to see Michael Yeats and to actually look at some of his...
I went first to see, years ago, I went out to have lunch with Michael Yeats, his son. And Michael was a big Fianna Fáiler, and I come from a family that were a big Fianna Fáiler. So we could talk, instead of talking about Yeats' poetry.
Explain what Fianna Fáil is for our non-Hibernian listeners.
Fianna Fáil is the main political party in Ireland that has held power. I mean, politically, it's probably the same position as the GLAS have, where they try to ally themselves with the nation and Catholic and sort of centre-right to being able to move into being a social democrat. Anyway, that's Fianna Fáil. It's an important Irish political party. And Michael Yeats that's really what he was interested in. And of course, everyone was always coming to him to talk about poetry. I didn't really know what to say to them because he wasn't really interested in poetry. He didn't know anything about poetry. So instead we talked, Fianna Fáil talk about various prime ministers and various ministers and various elections. And he really, really knew his elections, and he knew about American elections. And so we had a nice time, and then I went out into the hall at the back of the house, and I didn't know that the portrait of his grandfather, the self-portrait done by the old man, John Butler Yeats, had come back to Ireland and was hanging in the hallway of this house. And I turned, he was showing me something else, and I turned and looked at it. And because I had been writing about it, I've been thinking about it. John Butler Yeats started it in 1911. And he died in 1922. It still wasn't finished. He would scrape it off when it was working, and he did everything with it except finish it. And so I was thinking a lot about it. And there it was on the wall in the big high hallway. And I became interested in the father, John Butler Yeats. He did a marvelous thing when he was 68, and he was really having a bad time living with his daughters who were fighting with each other. He'd no money, no success. His son was becoming a famous poet. His other son was becoming a famous painter, Jack B. Yeats. And he decided just to go to America. When he went to America, he wouldn't come home. They couldn't get him to come home, and he'd no money. He'd no way of keeping himself. So he lived for 16 more years in New York, living in a boarding house. How they paid for him was that W.B. Yeats's manuscripts, he would write a poem, and he would have all the drafts of the poem. He would send them to this lawyer in New York called John Quinn, who would then own them. John Quinn would pay the old man's rent and lodgings.
Wow.
Down in West 29th Street. And the old man loved being in a boarding house because new people would come who hadn't heard his old stories before, and he would tell the old stories again. He loved telling his old stories. But he had a woman in Dublin and in London called Rosa Butt, the daughter of Isaac Butt. She looked in the portrait he made of her. She looks like a wonderful person, really, really wonderful. And he wrote to her. The agreement was that he would write to her, she would write to him, and they would burn the letters so that no one could see them in the future. So therefore they could say anything in the letters. But she kept his. And there is an extraordinary correspondence, because even as he's getting into his 80s, he still thinks he might marry her and they might all change their lives. He was filled with hope. He was filled with optimism. He was a marvelous character. He was useless as a father, as a father provider. He really couldn't ever make money. And he obviously his wife went nuts, and she died young. And Jack B. Yeats was more or less brought up in Sligo because his father had no way of keeping him in London. He had no money. But money never bothered him much. He was interested in what he called the game of life. He said he wouldn't mind a murderer as long as the murderer had some charm or some grace or something special. That he didn't make moral judgments. He made other judgments about sort of grace. And so he in his old age, he became like a child to his son, W.B. Yeats, became like a father to him, where the father became more and more like an infant. But and that's part of, in a way, the game of life, that he just wasn't joining the adult club. He could have become a barrister in Dublin. He would have become a judge. He was a serious man. He had a serious education, but he wanted to become an artist. And he became a failed artist. But the failed artist didn't bother him. And we know this from his correspondence. He became one of the great letter writers of the age. And his letters, John McGahern was a big admirer of his letters. And his letters try and tease out how to live in the world, what it means to be alive, what friendship means, what family means, what love means, what regret means. And he was also very interesting about Ireland. And wonderful things, like you watch him in 1916 and he's writing a letter saying, I've read this wonderful new book by James Joyce called Portrait of the Artist, or the Easter Rebellion, that they just realized immediately the executions were wrong, and the executions were being viewed very, very badly in America. And so those letters just after the rebellion are really prescient, are really interesting. So he was a great man. He was a great man. I noticed that say Bruce Arnold, who wrote a biography of his son, really disapproves of him because he really, really didn't care about looking after his family. And maybe that's what men should do. Maybe that's what parents should do. But he didn't do that. He did something else. And what he did was very interesting. And he fathered 4 very interesting children.
Yeah.
Poet, the painter, and Lolly and Lily, who ran Dunedin Press and were interesting, were really good book designers and figures who made tapestry and worked in a very interesting way.
How do you think he influenced Yeats's poetry, or did he influence? Anyway.
I think that the conversations in the house were always about the importance of art and how nothing else mattered, such as commerce, and gave Yeats this haughty feeling. I'm talking about this with Wilde as well, this idea of getting confidence from your parents. So that even though the Yeatses had no money, they had infinite amounts of haughtiness and confidence about the idea of themselves as artists. And certainly the old man would have given his son that. But what I think he gave him more than anything else was the old man could not finish anything, and the son became a great finisher. So you're talking about a sort of anxiety of influence where it isn't as though the son followed in the father's footsteps. But Jack Yeats and W. Yeats became great workers. They became very good at actually having money, making money from their art. The father never could do that. They finished everything they did. Just look at the Yeats' stanzas and the way the clanging rhymes, the sense of it ending in his poems. When a poem of his ends, it ends. With the father, that never was true with the paintings. The paintings were always unfinished or took years to make. So I think the influence was actually, it was a sort of negative one, that the son did what the father didn't do. And I think that sometimes with parents, that actually might be the thing that matters, that you don't do what your parents did, and that you do something different, and that is called influence too.
Colm, are you a Joni Mitchell fan?
Just before our love got lost, I said, I am as constant as a northern star. And you said, constancy in the darkness, where is that at? If you want me, I'll be in the bar.
There's a question here from somebody wondering if it's true that when you were nominated first time for the Booker Prize, that you got up on a table and sang the entire Joni Mitchell Blue album.
Look, I found there was a thing called a daytime flight from New York to London. And this was the night before the Booker shortlist was to be announced. And so I arrived at 8 o'clock in the evening in London thinking I would just go home quietly and go to bed. I was staying in a hotel, and then I met a friend of mine for a drink, and then I realized that I was just wide awake. I mean, it was, I didn't want to sleep, and I was quite excited about just being in a new city. And we stayed up very late, and there was a lot. Certainly there was a club called the Groucho Club, and they did eventually just say, "Sir, we've ordered a taxi for you. It is waiting outside." Because I think by that time,
big yellow taxi.
The last time I saw, no, Big Yellow Taxi is not on Blue. The last time I saw Richard was Detroit in '68, and he told me all good dreams were the same way, cynical and drunk and boring someone in some dark cafe. Well, I was boring somebody in some club in London.
Yeah.
That's a true story.
Question here, if you come from Sophia Faustine, do you think the relationship between the authors and their mothers were as significant as those with their fathers?
In the case of Yeats, absolutely not. There's almost no remnant of his mother in his. He talks. His mother's family were very important to him, the Pollocks, Spence, and Sligo, but she herself was not. In the case of Wilde, his mother was totally important for him. That she eventually came to London, but also she was much more. She was a poet and a translator. I think more significant as a translator or a collector of folk tales. So I think she had enormous effect on him because she was also someone who I think very much enjoyed the drama of social life. That she just loved putting on funny clothes and talking in a loud voice to a lot of people. And obviously this was something that Wilde used with figures like Lady Bracknell and Lady Illingsworth and all those figures in those 4 comedies he wrote. There's certainly an element of him putting his own mother on the stage in those plays. So I think that was very important. In the case of James Joyce, of course, it's his father rather than his mother you keep hearing about. And in the case of Joyce and Yeats, the mother dies young. And it is as though the penury, the not having money, the trying to run a household on nothing, really, really did affect their health. Not only made them unhappy, but actually I think caused early death in both cases.
So that brings us to the father of James Joyce. Yeats' father escaped the son, and in the case of Joyce, he escaped the father by going into exile.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like Wilde's father and like the father of Yeats, these fathers were great talkers. They were great social figures. And the sons had to convert that into industry, into work, into books. And so in the case of Joyce, his father was a great talker, he was a great singer, he was a great social figure around the town. And Joyce became, like Yeats, a great finisher. I mean, just look at how finished Ulysses is, ending with the word yes, a Y and an S, which the opening word is stately, an S and a Y. I mean, obviously all that lovely circularity which comes up in Finnegan's Wake as well. And he was a great finisher. The father was what we know, you see, there was a nightmare in the house, Joyce house. There was a second son called Stanislaus, who left 2 books describing just how miserable it was to have a drunken father. And Pappy is a rat. He would, you know, it was a diary. So he would go, Pappy is a rat. And Pappy would get, you know, he had owned 6 houses in Cork, which he drank. So he didn't have them anymore. He had a job as a rate collector, which he lost. So he was down to 1/3 of his salary. He was in his 40s. And the check would come in every month and he would go out drinking and he would have a marvelous time. Ulysses is very good on forgiving the father, on not showing what a nightmare he was in the house, coming home drunk and being abusive and just making everyone's life a misery. But what he was like when he went out. And of course, when he went out, what was marvelous about him was that he was a great singer, that he had a seriously beautiful tenor voice. Molly Bloom at the end of Ulysses just talks about how beautiful his voice was. Bloom witnesses him singing in the Ormond Hotel in the Sirens episode of Ulysses. And so Joyce shows his father at his most exalted, at his most sort of talented, at his most sort of socially acceptable. And that's a very interesting idea, that instead of spending a literary career in a state of resentment against his father, he spent his literary career trying to work out ways to forgive him.
Right, Colm, a few questions for you personally. Gentleman, I believe he's in either Istanbul or Ankara, by the name Menish. He asked, why does Brooklyn zoom into the female experience from the third person perspective?
It's really...
Sorry, just one other question. Does Eilish have her own voice in the narrative?
It's really, first of all, a book about my aunts and written in the years after my mother and her sisters had died. And it was a way of trying to reclaim those lives from the early 1950s, so that I was brought up in a house of women and I could, you know, I watched them like a hawk, and the conversations, the summer dresses, the talk about clothes, just the extraordinary ways their voices mingled. And so I wanted to work with all that. The question, yes, was, well, what sort of form would you use? So the form I used really was, I think, taken from the 19th century, from, say, Henry James's Washington Square, in which a young woman also faces her destiny, but she's not, like Eilish in Brooklyn, she's not highly self-conscious or bookish or someone who would have any desire to tell her own story. Eilish lives in shadow. She's someone who knows about shadow, and therefore to do it in the third person singular seemed to me the way that I could evoke her inner life in a way that if I gave her a voice, if I let her speak in the first person, she would be so hesitant about letting people know anything about herself. She's not Molly Bloom. She's not exuberant. She's shy. And so that was the reason for the form, was to move into what I would call third person intimate, right, where every thought is her in the book is her thought. Everything noticed, she notices. Everything remembered, she remembers, so that everything is from within her consciousness. But it includes a great deal of silence, things that she's noticing but not remarking on, things that she's remembering but not telling anyone about. So there's a lot that's withheld or held within. And the form that works best for that is what I would call third person intimate.
If any character is a victim of the story in Brooklyn, who would that be and why?
I suppose the character that's the victim is Jim in Ireland, in other words, that he enters this without knowing his secret. And he is the one who gets left behind. And I have to say, in a small town, if you've had a summer fling like that, and you've given your heart and soul to some girl, and she goes back to America without you knowing, everyone in the town would know that about you. You'd be marked forever. You know, that's the fella. He broke his heart. That broke his heart. You know, and people would talk about him like that for years. And so, yeah, I think he's the victim of it.
A question from Christina O'Shaughnessy here in Geneva. Would Colm like to tell us something about his own relationship with his father, perhaps?
Oh, my father died when I was 12 and became ill when I was 8. And so I didn't have that long relationship. But I was very close to him. He was a teacher, and he started a museum in the town, and he was good. And so that's my story. I mean, that's the story that's in the novel Nora Webster, and it's basically what happened.
Yeah. There's a lovely moment in this book we're discussing where you talk about, you knew when you visited Dublin for the first time, I think, crossing the road in Westland Row, knew enough to look left, look right, and look left again.
Yeah, in the town, the extraordinary control over children. Like, do not cross the road. My father to Dublin, and I said he was already crossing when a car seemed to be coming, but he would know he'd get across before it came. But where I was when I was a child, so that I remember that as a big moment. But also, they talked about him that he was banned from most of the Dublin bookshops as a student because he would go into the bookshop, go up a ladder, and start reading the book. Until the people would have to come and tell him that he was to get down on the ladder and go home, or to buy the book and get out of the bookshop. And that used to be a story told about him.
They're more tolerant these days, huh?
Yeah.
The film of Brooklyn changed the ending. How did you feel about that?
Good. I thought it was a good thing to do. I think there's a different contract between a writer and readers and the maker of a film and the audience. I think in a novel, you're asking people to imagine so much all the time. You can't show them every color, every single thing that's in the room. So they're imagining all the time that there's what else is there. And you can leave them an ending that isn't complete. And the reader can put the book down and sort of imagine what might happen. I think the contract with a film is completely different, where you're showing everything. Everything is being dramatized and shown, what stripes on the shirt, what way the collar was on the shirt, the glasses, everything, every single thing is available. So when you come to the end, you can't just peter it out without some drama. And the bit that really, I've seen the movie a good number of times, the bit that really makes me tear up is the ending that I didn't write. I always find when I don't want to give the plot away, but there's a moment where, he doesn't see her. His brother does, and then he does. I just get all soft during that.
Yeah, it's a great film. So, Colm, we're coming near the end of the GLAS hour, and I have a lovely question here which foreshadows what we had discussed already. Would Colm read something, anything? He's such a beautiful reader, something of his own writing, perhaps, or anything at all.
I have a thing here that it's a novel that I finished that I'm trying to revise at the moment. I suppose it's coming out next year. It's called The Magician, and it's a novel about the life of Thomas Mann. But there's a moment in the life of Thomas Mann in 1933 when the Nazis have taken over in Munich, and he's in Switzerland, and he realizes that they probably have his diaries, and his diaries are compromising. They've got loads of stuff about his homosexuality, and he realizes that the Nazis could now destroy him. He's trying to get the diaries out, or trying to see where they are, who has them. And this is just 2 paragraphs. Everything he wrote, this is Thomas Mann, 1933. Everything he wrote revealed something hidden. Novels and stories were a way to make what had once been private become public. His best work, he believed, explored in print, but he'd never shared with anyone. The diaries simply took this one step further. Thoughts that would have been lost, intimate things, were registered in these secret pages. He was the most private person, but he wished also to be known. The diary was a perfect vehicle for such ambiguous feelings. He wrote the diary in peacetime, with the firm view that the peace would hold. For years, no one imagined that Hitler would really take power, or that he and his followers would then pursue those who did not support them with such relentlessness. It was unimaginable, even a year earlier, that the Nazis might one day come to his house to look for his private papers.
Wow, Colm, thank you so much. That was
Thank you very much,
real feeling of having an exclusive there.
Yeah.
When will the book be out?
I don't know, sometime next year, either May or September next year. I think there's probably, since about half the novelists of the world are going to announce that they've just written a new novel. It's going to be a big queue of novels, and this will join the queue.
Great. Well, Colm, thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay.
And I highly recommend your website to viewers if they want to find out more about your work.
Okay.
And of course, no doubt that they should all get a copy of Mad, Bad, Dangerous to Know. It's a fantastic read. Thank you so much, Colm.
Thank you very much. Take care. Take care, everybody. Okay, bye. Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Okay, take care.